Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and you're all very welcome to this, our 10th Dante dialogue. And this particular one has been a long time in the making, and I'm delighted that both Aistė and Elsina have managed to put it together. It's entitled Figurando il Paradiso, Dante and the Representation of Paradise between Literary and Visual Arts. I'm going to pass over to them, and they're going to take control of today's proceedings. A voi la parola.
Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to have you all online. And as the email circulated indicated, we're going to have a really interesting dialogue between a literary scholar and a scholar of visual arts. So it's going to be very much mixed media. And we apologize for any technical mishaps that might happen as we try to switch slides and do things like that. But again, it's a great pleasure to have first of all, Professor Martin Kemp, who I'm going to introduce. And so Professor Martin Kemp is an emeritus professor in the history of arts at Trinity College at University of Oxford. He was trained in natural sciences and art history at Cambridge University, as well as Courtauld Institute in London. His books are very many. We include just a few on the slides that seem the most relevant to today's talk. And they include The Science of Art, Optical Themes in Western Art. He's also published and broadcast extensively on Leonardo da Vinci. And something else that might be interesting to non-literary historians among you is that he also wrote regularly for Nature. And his essays have been published as visualizations and developed also in the book Seen and Unseen, both published with Oxford. His recent books, and one of the books we're going to be talking a lot about today, I think, is also Visions of Heaven, Dante and the Art of Divine Light, and also Hockney's Eye. He's now full-time speaking, writing, and broadcasting, and he's been a trustee of the National Galleries of Scotland, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and British Museum. He is distinguished professor at the China Academy. And Elsina, would you like to introduce Federico?
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Elsina Caponetti, and I'm very, very happy that we managed to put together this dialogue. So Federico Rossi studied at the University of Pisa, the Scuola Normale Superiore, and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Roma Tre, within a project in the library of the Franciscan Convent of Santa Croce. He is currently a junior core fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Central European University, with a project entitled Imagining the Life of Christ, Affective Devotion and Vernacular Audience in Late Medieval Italy. From July 2025, he will be a Swiss postdoctoral fellow at the Università della Svizzera Italiana, and his main research interests are in the cultural history of medieval Italy, with a particular focus on Dante's work, Franciscan literature, and vernacular translation. In 2024, he published the book Il sogno di Scipione e la visione di Dante, dalla tradizione di Macrobio alla commedia, which is also open access, so if you want to have a look. And recently he published an article that is quite interesting for our topic today, that we'll be discussing today, Figurando il Paradiso, Dante poeta del mondo celeste, published in La vita delle cose, edited by Stefano Brandi for Longo editor. Yeah, we thank everyone for being here again. The idea is to have about 1 hour, a bit more of the dialogue between Professor Kemp and Dr. Rossi about the representation of Paradise both in visual and textual arts, to understand what the great innovation of Dante's Paradiso was and what legacy the poet left for artists of generation to come. So Aistė and I will pose a few questions, and we hope that this will then engage the public as well in a dialogue. So Aistė, if you want to start with the first question.
Thank you, Federico. Sure, we do have lots of questions, and it's going to be interesting to see the speakers talk to each other from their own disciplinary perspective and see where some of the possible overlaps may be. Again, we do want to have some questions from the audience towards the end, so do think of those questions, put them in the chat, put them on a piece of paper and ask them later. So the first question we do have is sort of the hardest of them all, in a way, I guess, because the most generic, so we don't have to have a sort of complete answer at this point yet necessarily, but we do want you to talk a little bit about kind of maybe share your initial reflections on the question of what is and isn't representable in Paradise. What's particularly innovative or interesting about how Dante approaches this question of representability, and what some later artists might be learning from Dante potentially. And I guess the trope and so the kind of the common sense opinion in Dante studies is often that Paradise is less represented than representable in some ways, compared to other worldly realms. So I would be curious to know if you agree with that kind of assessment, and if so, or if not, even what kind of literary strategies, but also what kind of pictorial strategies might be useful in approaching the questions of representability or non-representability.
So who shall start about this very fundamental question? Maybe I can start telling something about Dante, if you're hearing me. And first of all, naturally, I'm thanking you very much for organizing this dialogue. And I'm being short like that to leave more space to our conversation. But I'm really happy to be here and to have this conversation with you all. And yes, naturally, Paradise is the most innovative part of Dante's comedy, the one he had least resources in his models and sources to resort to in shaping his poem. And actually, one way to try to answer to this impossible question of which is so special about Dante's visualization of Paradise is trying to look at what kind of horizons of possibilities he had at disposal when deciding to write a representation about the other world and the afterlife. And naturally, I'd say the two main traditions were at hand. The first one was the tradition of visions, of medieval visions of the afterlife, and the second one was the classical tradition. And well, the first one, which I start from that one, which is so well studied in Ireland. So I'm sure that there are a lot of experts about that in the audience. But this tradition was not so helpful to Dante in about shaping Paradise, where we find so many ideas about so many elements about the visualization of hell, which Dante probably knew and used in his text. It's not quite the same about Paradise. And the text which is more frequently quoted is naturally the Visio Pauli, actually a late antique one. But I have to specify that the part of the Visio Pauli about Paradise was not diffused. And that was quite surprising when I find out that the manuscript transmitting the Paradise part of the Visio Pauli are only located in Germany, in areas of Europe Dante did not have access to. And so quoting the Visio Pauli for Paradise is actually misleading. And then if we look at the text of the Visio Pauli, we see that the visualization of Paradise is quite an abstract one, because the text only says that Dante was translated to the third heaven, and that's naturally the idea taken from the letter by Paul, that it was someone which was thought to be Paul himself was translated into the third heaven. But then the third heaven is just not described, but alluded to as a palace with a door and columns and so on, a heavenly palace. And then Paul just descends into other heavens, two heavens which are not described at all. And that's all what we find in this vision. And in other medieval visions, we find the classical traditional images of the heavenly garden or the heavenly castle, the heavenly palace, or the celestial Jerusalem taken from the Apocalypse. And these are all possible ways to describe the paradise. And now, actually, I also prepared some slides more for images than for text, actually. But these are some. I hope you're seeing that. But these are a couple of 12th century representations of heaven as celestial paradise. This one is in nowadays France, in the Dauphiné, in Saint-Chef. And we have an example in Italy too, a beautiful example in Civate. And this is the kind of imagery we mostly find also in visions about how to imagine the celestial, how to imagine paradise, so a celestial city, which even has a countryside in certain visions. And these images were not very apt to writing a poem as long and a cantica as long as Paradiso is, because they are quite static. While descriptions of hell are also in visions are shaped as a series of places, Paradise is just one place, and that puts naturally a problem for someone like Dante who wants to describe a series of meetings with blessed souls and so on. And in order to emphasize the difficulty of describing heaven, I like to recall some passages from Boncompagno da Signa, who was this great master of rhetorics of the 13th century, which who wrote about memory and mechanism to remember things. And there's also a chapter about memory of paradise. And this is a quite famous text, which has been recalled by all the great scholars of memory, like Francis Yates or Merrick Rudders and so on. And here, Boncompagno just says that it's impossible to describe paradise. It's not possible for humans, and it would be too daring, too bold to try to say something about how paradise is. And the interesting thing is that one could say, yes, it's just a standard way for a rhetoric master to treat theological matters. He just doesn't want to mix into theological matters. But the interesting thing is that before that, there's a chapter on hell. And on hell, Boncompagno has a perfect solution. He says, okay, in order to remember hell, just think about a volcano like Etna, because we kind of think that hell is where Etna is, and so it's very, very simple. You can just think of that, and it's a perfect solution for hell. And so, in the light of that, it's even more surprising that when we arrive to paradise, Boncompagno doesn't have any solution. And so we are seeing. I'm going to finish my discourse, but about the visions of paradise, they were not very helpful for Dante, and so Dante resorted to the other tradition, the classical one. And here, the first author to be quoted is naturally Virgil. But Virgil, once again, did not give a very, very useful solution, because as we all know, there isn't a place like paradise in the Virginia Otherworld, and the most similar place are the Elysian Fields, which are in the underworld, an underground place. Even if Virgil suggests that there are some ethereal fields, there is some air, some fields made of air in the Elysian Fields, and so the commentators like Servius or Macrobius said, yes, there's a contradiction. There are some signs that a heavenly place for blessed souls is possible. And then there's, last of all, but maybe the most important one, there's Cicero, then the dream of Scipio. And as it has been recalled, I've written this book published last year on the afterlife of Cicero's dream of Scipio, and the commentary by Macrobius. And I'm not entering in that because it would be too long and it would lead us astray from our path. But what's interesting to notice is that Cicero describes a celestial place where the meeting between Scipio and his grandfather and father takes place. And this idea of a celestial place, which is put in the circle of the fixed stars, and Macrobius describes the heavens, the planetary heavens, and even if Macrobius' model is not the same as Dante's, it's an interesting text Dante could reference to. And so that's probably from here that Dante gets the idea of setting the whole series of encounters in the planetary heavens and in the heaven of the fixed stars. And the heaven of the fixed stars is like a point to draw to sum up the meetings with the souls which took places in the first heavens. And that is why, in my opinion, it's in the heaven of the fixed stars that we find the famous passage on Figurando il Paradiso, on how to represent paradise. And the interesting thing is that we are still in the path to the Empyrean, which is the actual paradise. But this is a narrative threshold, which is interesting, which Dante wants to stress by inserting this famous passage on the fact that it is impossible to represent heaven in a figurative manner, because it's figurando, it's the way the verb Dante uses. And in my opinion, this figurando is not a reference to the figura, Auerbach's figura, but it's really figurando in sense of representing, of how to give a visual representation. And here maybe I could stop, and then the last thing I could say is that the thing that brings Dante to this image of Figurando il Paradiso is that how is it's difficult to represent not the heavens, but the smile of Beatrice. So probably the highest point of difficulty for Dante to represent paradise is Beatrice's holy smile, and that tells us something on what kind of paradise Dante is describing, which is also a personal one. And that was the first answer to this very, very difficult question.
All right, thank you so much, Federico. And I mean, when you're speaking, I was also struck by maybe that's something for a later discussion, not necessarily for now, because it sort of distracts us from the main path in some ways. But I was really struck by certain things you're saying about the sources and sort of maybe lack of exact sources, or how they might be coming together in interesting ways. Also remind me of what Francesca Bausi in a recent essay in the Voci sul Purgatorio was saying about Purgatorio as well, how also when you're looking at the sort of kind of medieval vision tradition, not so much a classical one, he was also saying, well, people have been trying to find all kinds of analogs, but it's never in one exact analog. It's always several possible sources coming together. It's never actual, you wouldn't necessarily even use the term source. It would be something else, some kind of model, some sort of image, maybe some sort of potential there, but it's never an exact kind of thing. So I think some of the problems might be similar between Purgatorio and Paradiso, but maybe that's something for later discussion, because I also wanted to Martin to chime in as well, and to maybe talk about what, from his point of view as an art historian, what are the specific challenges of representing paradise, and how they might be similar or different to those of depicting hell or purgatory. And maybe you have something to say about Federico's images as well, if you want to.
Well, it's very much the case, as Federico suggested, that Paradiso is ineffable. It somehow lies outside normal systems of representation. I came at this as a specialist, amongst other things, on Renaissance perspective, perspectiva or prospettiva in Italian, and it's the relationship of that to medieval and classical optics. And it was less reading the Paradiso that I got a sense of how that tradition interacted with what Dante was doing, and much more the Convivio. I'm always slightly surprised the Convivio doesn't feature bigger in Dante scholarship, as looking at it as an outsider. It's incredibly valuable in terms of his own commentary on what he is doing and what he's thinking of. And we can find, for instance, that geometry itself is ineffable, it's perfect. And there's a quotation, this is from Convivio. As Euclid said, the point is the beginning of this, the geometry. And as he says, the circle is the most perfect figure, which must therefore be adopted as its end. As between its beginning and its end, geometry moves between the point and the circle, and these two are inimical to certainty, for the point in itself cannot be measured because of its indivisibility, and it is impossible to square the circle perfectly because of its curvature, and so it cannot be measured precisely. Geometry is furthermore the most pure, bianchissima is the term he uses there, the most stain-free, in that it is without the stain of error, and is most certain both in itself and its handmaid, which is called perspectiva. So the foundations of our understanding of space, form, and so on is in this ineffable world. And these things are then realized in an organic, material way, but they never have that absolute perfection. And on the slide 2, these two rather fierce diagrams are both indications of the medieval system of how the eye works with the crystalline humor and the aqueous humor and so on. I don't want to go into that in detail, but it's very complicated. And what we assume is that the perspective of optics gives us certainty, it gives us rules, it gives us control. But if you put the medieval system in there, the optics are incredibly complicated. The eyes are a very complicated mechanism. It never sees anything absolutely perfectly. So you've got this sense of the last bit of optical science as dealing with the unseeable, the uncertain, something that's too dark, too fast, too bright. And these come up again and again in the Convivio, but they also come up in Paradiso, where things are too bright. You know, Dante repeatedly has his sight overwhelmed because his terrestrial senses cannot handle the sublimity of the divine light, and it recurs throughout. And it's amazing how he managed to give really good literary, poetic, and symbolic variety to a description of the same thing, which is basically the breakdown of of Dante's earthly senses. Perspective doesn't work when he goes into Paradiso and sees the thrones and sees Beatrice. She is both far away and close. She isn't diminished in the distance by the rules of perspective, whereas Paradise doesn't work like that. Paradise is a rule-free area. And of course, that makes it very difficult in terms of representation, which you're doing something which is insistently saying, without Beatrice's intervention, something that's unseeable. This again is a kind of nice quote from the Convivio and gives a sense of the medieval optics. I should also mention that Simon Gilson, my fellow professor here in Oxford, the Serena professor, has written a very brilliant book on Dante and optics, to which this is no more than a mere footnote. Anyway, this is in the commentary. These visible things come into the eye as though through transparent glass. The passage that visible form makes through this medium is completed in the water within the pupil of the eye, because that water has a boundary, almost like a mirror, which is glass backed by lead, so that it cannot pass any further, but is arrested there like a ball that is stopped when it strikes something, so that the form, and form is a very important word there, which cannot be seen in the transparent medium, now appears lucid and defined. the visual spirit, which passes from the pupil to the front of the brain, is where the sensitive power and where it is represented without passage of time. And thus we see it when it's not only without the absolute geometry of space, but it also is outside time in that sense as well. This, of course, is a terrifically difficult thing to represent, because you're stressing something which doesn't obey the rules of perspective, the diminution of forms, and so on. And it's very remarkable how Dante is able to use that. And I found it, much to my surprise, the commentary and Dante himself was pretty much saturated in ideas from medieval optics, and above all in the Islamic tradition. Ibn al-Haytham, the book of his De Aspectibus, as it's called in Latin, is one of the all-time great books. It's not sufficiently reckoned in the West, but it is an absolute masterpiece of empirical and speculative science. Al-Hazan, as he's called in the West, or Ibn al-Haytham. And what Dante is describing there is a simplified version, simplified for the purpose of the poem, of the medieval optical system. And just finally, to end this little discourse, there's a bit in the commentary in Convivio which works absolutely beautifully with Mona Lisa and with these lovesick men who are continually grappling with the ineffability of their beloved ladies. Here it should be known that although many things can enter the eye at the same time, it is true that whatever enters along a straight line into the center of the pupil is truly seen, is the only one that imprints itself on the imagination. This is in Alberti's book on perspective as well. He says there's one eye which comes perpendicularly into the eye, and this is the supreme measuring bit of the optical apparatus. And here is Dante saying this. This is because the nerve along which the visual spirit runs is orientated to this part. Therefore, one eye cannot really look into another eye unless it is seen by it, just as the one who aims their sight receives the form in the pupil, the form again, along a straight line. So along that same line, its own form departs into the eye it aims at, and many times along the extension of this line is discharged the bow of him against all weapons are feeble. The centric ray, in other words, this perpendicular ray, if Cupid fires his arrows down that, it goes straight through, zoom. And the onlooker, the lovesick man, is smitten by a love which he simply cannot avoid, as it's come optically straight in the center. I found this lovely, this idea that you could go from the Alberti's centric ray, or in Islamic science as it was, or John Peckham or Bacon in medieval philosophy, that you could take that piece of optical geometry and turn it into a metaphor of being unable to avoid Cupid's darts. End of dialogue, end of monologue.
Thank you so much, Martin. I was also struck when you're speaking about, I'm someone who's been interested in all kinds of sensory illusions and sensory hallucinations almost, and I was struck by how much of that there is in Purgatorio, I guess, especially to me. But then you really need to come to Paradise to get to the point where the perspective doesn't really work, where optics really properly breaks down, where these things can be transformed in some fundamental way. It's no longer just hallucinations or illusions, but something seems to be working a slightly different way. And should we just
I
move
was
to the
thinking,
second?
if I may enter
Yeah.
point, some comments on what Martin just said. That first of all, I'd like to recall that the end of of Paradise is, of Dante's Paradise is, Dante sees these circles of different colors but the same dimension, which is Dante's paradoxical approach to geometry. It's true that geometry is so important to Dante's representation of heaven, and it's something that it's not always stressed by the Dantisti as it should. And actually, the final solution which Dante gets to after all the attempts of representing it is just a paradoxical geometric solution, the fact that there are different circles of different colors, but only one dimension, and that, which is the Trinity, naturally. And Dante struggles to grasp the concept of that. And there's also an even more difficult thing to say that how these different circles also deliver the image of the human image of Christ, so the incarnation. And Dante is just trying to get a comprehension of that, as most of you probably know, but the final image Dante resorts to is that of the attempt to square the circle. And so we know that at the very end of the comedy, the problem of squaring the circle is the one Dante resorts to as it's like it was saying. In the Empyrean, we have this sort of paradoxical geometry problem, which is as hard as on the Earth is squaring the circle. And so it gets this geometrical point of reference. And then I was struck by the fact of the image and the rays touching the eye and the reference to Mona Lisa. Also thinking of the Vita Nova, because in the Vita Nova we find many of these scenes in which Dante describes how I was looking directly at Beatrice, but there another woman was on the trajectory, and then things happening because of that. And so I never thought of that, but it really is thinking in geometrical ways. So it was very interesting, that.
Yeah, the last statement, of course, my high imagination, that's fantasia, and fantasia was a faculty of the human brain. And it wasn't free-range fantasy, it combined elements from what was seen. So fantasia is less fantasy quite in our terms, but it was a very specific function of the brain which could compound images from diverse sources and make them into a coherent whole. I was struck all the way through, and I get into this via Leonardo to a degree. But also writing the science of art, I read the various textbooks, the various very sophisticated books on optics. Optics was probably the most sophisticated of all the sciences in the Middle Ages. Deeply impressive, and as I said, the Islamic scientists played a major role in that, both in transmitting classical ideas, but also on their own account of optics as a experimental science, but also as one which showed how delusory science is, how slippery it is, how you cannot rely upon it. And that appears again and again in Dante, that slipperiness of normal seeing.
Yeah, about this, so talking about the real ontology of light, so in Dante's Paradiso, we understand that actually light is what is like the composing paradise, like that the heaven is actually pure light, as they say as Dante writes in Paradiso 30. We have issued from the largest body to the heaven of pure light, light intellectual, full of love of true good, full of joy that surpasses every sweetness. So I was always struck by this definition of intellectual light. And I was wondering, like, if you have any thoughts about the real ontology of this light in paradise, like how is it different in a way from the natural light we see every day, and how do artists and Dante poets distinguish between what is divine light and what is natural light? So if there is any way to distinguish the two.
Yeah, this is a big dilemma, of course, because when you're dealing with Gothic painting, stained glass windows, you've got light actually in the image itself, the light which comes through the windows and is coloured by the glass. You've got the gold backgrounds to a Madonna, say, and that is a space of infinite eternal light, because it reflects the light in a particular kind of way. Once you do away with that, and you all the painter has got left is not gold, because there's almost a prescription in Renaissance artists in using actual gold. You used yellow. what you end up with is having to show divine light with just pigments. You know, you've got your lead tin yellow, you've got your lead white, and so on. And that's the limit of what you can do. Various artists, including Piero della Francesca, Raphael, and so on, found ways around that, but it's a real dilemma because you can't count upon the light coming through the window in the glass, or the burnished gold leaf which reflected the light in this way. Once you translate all that into terrestrial terms, into terms of standard optics, then the artist got a big dilemma.
Yeah, in a way, like gold had great potentialities, but after the abandonment of it, like they had to find different strategies and to communicate this idea of divinity in the representations. If I understand correctly, they had to adopt different strategies during the Renaissance. And is there anything in that Dante might have contributed in a way?
Yeah, well, Raphael, who in a sense is the painterly hero of the Divine Light book, rather unexpectedly. And I studied Raphael with John Shearman at the Courtauld, who's one of the great art historians, very much underrated today. But it was Raphael, in a way, who pointed forward as to how you could actually cope with the loss of the traditional way of portraying light. This, for instance, the Sistine Madonna, he invents, or doesn't quite invent, Fra Bartolomeo had probably invented it, these cloud putti who get blasted into just pure light. They get brighter and lighter until the form totally dissolves. You can see in the Sistine Madonna, this is slide number 29. You can see in the Sistine Madonna that he's pumping up the contrast between the silhouetted dark costume of the Virgin and the background, which is ineffable. The putto heads that were there, more or less discernible as cloudy things, simply disappear. They're no longer there. It's a very Dantesque motif. It's worth saying that Giovanni Santi's, Raphael's father, who died when Raphael was 11, 12, he was called a second Dante, which is completely absurd, of course, but he wrote a big rhyming chronicle in honor of Federico da Montefeltro, and he had ambitions to do. Yeah, that's a sheet in relating to the I think the designs in the Stanza della Segnatura. And this is his not very brilliant, but pious attempt to write a sonnet in nice italic handwriting, right? Almost as nice as Michelangelo's. So Raphael was very much in that tradition. He would have known about his father's ambitions to be a second Dante, even if, of course, they're completely absurd. And he is the most poetic of all the painters.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. Federico, I was wondering if you could say something about, let's say, a bit the same problem, but using the words. So, of course, we said that in literature, not many after Dante dared represent paradise. We understand why. As you said, it's only one place, but Dante wanted to say more about it and had to find different strategies in order to expand a bit is in a way the way he represented paradise, used, of course, or only using the words, but at the same time there are constraints in words as well. So how Dante, in a way, tried to express the ineffable of paradise using language, and what do you think it was the most innovative thing about the way Dante approached this challenge, which was, as you said, different from medieval visionaries before? So he had not many, in a way, models to approach this challenge.
Yeah,
Sure.
I was amazed when I was looking at this, at the brilliance, and I obviously don't know all the medieval texts which obviously lie behind this, but the way he's able to take, say, what had previously would have been a gilded dome with angels distributed not for reasons of optics but for reasons of piety in a certain way. And this is a very nice quotation, I think, which gets at that. So great a light, what is the full size of this rose extending to its furthest petals? My sight in breadth and height was not confounded, but took in the full extent and nature of the jubilation. Nearness and distance add nothing, take away nothing, because where God governs without an intermediary, natural law holds no sway. And that to me is an absolutely key one of somehow Dante manages to write about something and in a sense seeing the sensory impression of something without being able to see it. It's a total paradox and is completely mind-blowing.
Yes, there's also the sense of paradox I get from the Empyrean, because it's a place where natural laws do not rule, and so Dante has to find a paradoxical form of realism, because if you refer to ideas for Dantean realism such as the one by Auerbach, Dante is the poet of the earthly world. And so realism in Dante is in reference to how he's able to describe in a very vivid way the things of our world. But then the Empyrean and the Paradise and Empyrean specifically stays out of this vision, because it's like something totally different from what we experience here. But if we think of the sense of the world as Dante did, actually is this world, this earthly world, which is a paradox, which is an inversion, because when Dante arrives to the Crystallinum and he looks at the Empyrean above himself, and he has been going far and far and far away from the center of the universe. But then in the Empyrean, it's the opposite. God is another center. And so how can the universe have two different centers? And this is something which has been compared to the theory of relativity, the trisphere of contemporary physics. And I'm not naturally saying that Dante was forecasting contemporary physics, but he arrived to something quite similar in that the boundaries of the universe aren't a limit, but are just the boundaries to another opposite universe, reverse universe, which is the God, which the angels and the blessed around him. And that's why it's so wrong that in most of representations we see the paradise as a series of heavenly circles, wider and wider and wider, and then the Empyrean like a small crown on the top of it. But that's not the image Dante had in his mind, because the Empyrean was just, if you want, as big as all of the rest, even if it's a place without dimensions. And so it's a beyond, which is a way to arrive to the real world. And so the realism should be the realism of Empyrean and not of this world. And going back to light, which is something which was very important also in the context of Dante's formation and education, because we know that in Florence, the Franciscan convent of Santa Croce, there was at least one copy of the De Luce by Bartolomeo da Bologna. So the very last treatise on light composed in Bologna was present in Florence in the hands of the Franciscan of Santa Croce, and specifically Servasanto da Faenza. And so we know that this kind, and that is the treatise when we find that very, very precise distinction between light, luce, lux, lumen, radium, so the very terminology Dante uses. And so if we, now I'm resorting to my slides again, if I'm able to project them, but to show them. And so this is one slide I had put thinking of a slightly different discourse on love and desire in Dante's Paradise. But the second passage I put here is the very, very famous one about the universe seen as a book. When Dante gets to see legato con amore in un volume ciò che per l'universo si squaderna, quindi the pages scattered through the universe by love into a single volume bound. And the context of this very, very important declaration of what Dante does at the end of this journey are enclosed between a light, a lux in the first tercet. So Dante fixes his eyes upon eternal light, and then he says, what I'm telling you in this way is but a simple light. And you see that in the English translation, it's just a simple light, but the Italian word is lume, which is more precise than that, because lux, luce, is what is the source of light, the God, and lume, this sort of splendor, is what Dante is able to convey to us. And by the way, I think, but it's just my suggestion, I'm curious of hearing what Martin thinks about that. I think that this very passage about seeing legato con amore in un volume ciò che per l'universo si squaderna is what the illustrator of the Urbino Dante is thinking of when illustrating in that way the last canto. Because yes, we have the three circles with the three mysteries Dante contemplates, and then the rest of the world, if we know. So I think that here the illustrator is really trying to deliver one synthetic vision of all the universe, just as the one Dante describes. Oh, sorry, maybe I could have done so to make it bigger under your eyes. And then to answer of the question about the different means Dante adopts to deliver this representation of paradise, light is not enough in a way, because he could just say that divine light is beyond representation. It would be all. And so Dante resorts to other types of means. And for instance, earlier I mentioned that images of the garden or the palace or the earthly Jerusalem, the earthly city. And the interesting thing is that Dante does not adopt these kind of representations on a first ground. It doesn't say, I've arrived to the heavenly city or I've arrived to the heavenly garden. But he recovers this kind of imagery as metaphors. And so the paradise is full of metaphors which are references to the garden. For instance, Christ is the gardener of the eternal garden, which is not an actual garden described as such, but as a metaphor. And then the blessed are described as gems, as the gems of the heavenly Jerusalem, but we don't see actual gems in his paradise. And then at the end, there is this series of imageries of those that Dante calls umbriferi prefazi, so shadowy prefaces to truth, and which are a series of images which are put in place just for him, to give him a sort of preliminary taste of the final vision. But actually, they are there for the reader, because the reader will not attain the same degree of final union with God which Dante, the character, is attaining. And so the reader has to content himself with the shadowy prefaces. And this thing of shadowy prefaces actually led me to think about another resource Dante uses for describing paradise, because there's not only light but also the shadow. And that's interesting, because for 3 times Dante resorts to the image of shadows to describe the paradise. And the first one is the first canto, when Dante says that he will be happy if he is able to deliver to the readers just the shadow of what he saw, because it's impossible to convey the actual vision he had, but a shadow of it will be enough. And here I think that here it's also a bit of the Neoplatonic idea that the light of this world is only a shadow of the real light, of the true light of God. So there is this dialectic. And then we have the Ombriferi Prefazi, which I just mentioned, the shadowy prefaces of the truth, which are such because Dante himself and the readers are not ripe enough to have a full comprehension of the vision. And the third reference to the shadow is the most fascinating one, is the one about the shadow of Argo, the ship, the first ship which was sailing at the beginning of human history. And so this time is just the reference to shadows is just inside a comparison. Dante says that just one instant of his vision is impossible to remember, even if the memory of the ship Argo was there for 25 centuries. But in order to describe Argo, Dante has this incredible idea of describing the shadow of it seen by the god Neptune in the water, which is an extraordinary example of Dante's realism, if you think about it. And it's difficult not to think that Dante is also suggesting that the memory of his poem is just the shadow of this ship sailing through the centuries, even if that's not exactly what Dante says, but it's mere a suggestion. And here I'm going on to show you to recall the visualizations of that. Naturally, the genial artist who dares to represent the shadow of Argo is Giovanni Di Paolo in the Yates Thompson comedy, which an illustrator who loves to put on paper the metaphors and the images and the comparisons Dante draws in his text. And it actually represents the shadow of Argo, which reminds me of another picture that I love by Giovanni Di Paolo, which is this Entombment of Christ, when Giovanni Di Paolo dares to represent the projected shadow of Nicodemus, I think. And I'm curious about what Martin thinks about that, but I think that we are really at the origins of representing the projected shadow in painting. I mean, as far as I know, there's something and forecasting it in Giotto, but here are really the first examples of showing the projected shadow. And in my opinion, that's another place where Dante could have a role in art history, because Dante is so precise in Purgatory in describing how the shadow of Virgil is not there because Virgil does not cast a shadow because he's a soul, while Dante does cast a shadow. And so if you look at what Giovanni Di Paolo does, it's difficult not to think that Dante was a strong factor in giving him the idea of this genre of representations. And
there's an echo there of, sorry.
No, go.
There's an echo there of Michelangelo. For the most part, Michelangelo uses light as an adjunct to form. It's not got a terrific independent presence, which is rather surprising, but that's how it works out, with one great exception, the conversion of St. Paul, the conversion of Saul, where the light coming down from the heaven, this sort of reverse light, where and very, very cleverly Paul tries to fend off the light with his hand, and of course it doesn't. You can't do that. You can't interrupt divine light by putting your hand up, because it's not material. It doesn't cast a shadow. And I love setting this quotation against the Michelangelo collapsing Saul, who, when he's being blinded, I felt weighing upon my forehead a splendor much greater than before. Splendor is an optical term. It means the scintillation of shine and reflection off an object. So lux lumen splendore, splendor. Anyway, it's a technical term. A splendor much greater than before, so that I raised my hand to the top of my eyes, made myself a shield from the sun's rays to scrape away the visual superfluity. Rather a florid translation, but I think rather good. And that's really a very Dantesque motif, and painter who is greatly influenced by Dante, but not so much optically, because he isn't chiefly concerned with optics per se. The slide I had up there for some time, which is the Raphael Disputar, it might just be worth, and this has come out listening to you, Federico, talking about these visual spatial paradoxes. This is a Disputar, this is slide number 27 in the Stanza della Segnatura. And I've always been puzzled by what seemed to be a rather archaic aspects of this, the actual gilding and the three-dimensional modeling of the putos amongst the clouds in the gold part of the sky, the aureole surrounding Christ, look fairly traditional in a way. And I think what he's doing here is actually an interesting hybrid, recognizing that you couldn't really do heaven and this vision of the Christ and the disciples, you couldn't really do that with Orthodox perspective. And in fact, it's a completely anomalous, paradoxical physical structure he's got there. If you look at Christ and there's the Holy Spirit, the dove of the Holy Spirit, vertically below Christ, and that by implication is vertically above the monstrance on the altar. So you've got an axis there running through the middle of the composition, perfectly clear axis. But if you then think about it, you've got a semicircle of figures down here, you've got a semicircle of figures down there. Now they can't be the same size, and they can't be in the same position, because you've got Christ is right in the front of the picture plane. So there's a total perspectival paradox there, which I hadn't aligned at all, but hearing you talking, he's a clever bloke, Raphael. Is he this clever? I think the answer is probably yes. You can create a structure which optically is Renaissance, that optically looks logical, but it still retains gold, and it's still full of an absolutely central paradox, which means you can't read that as a orthodox spatial construction. Anyway, it's just a thought that washed up along the way.
And I do have some questions and curiosities about colors, I guess, because just reading Martin's book, I was struck by, the importance, the kind of things you can do, 25 shades of white, the way that helps to convey different varieties of light and so on. I was just thinking, maybe as Dante scholars, maybe we don't often talk enough about colors in Dante and varieties of color in Dante. So I mean, there's an article I read in sort of preparation for this, and so to satisfy my curiosity about colors, and that's by Antonella Ippolito. But she's mostly talking about the varieties of shadows and sort of dark colors, and hardly anything, a little bit on Purgatorio, but hardly anything on Paradise. So I don't know if also Federico wanted to say anything about colors in Paradise, or how that maybe comparing to other celestial realms in Dante, but also Martin as well, if he had something to say on the use of color. I mean, because something else I was also looking at recently is early printed books of Dante. They often have all kinds of illustrations, wood block illustrations, but unless someone colors them in, they're not really using color per se, and maybe not using light in the same kind of way. So the ways you can represent light seems a bit more limited without a color. So that's just my curiosity about sort of pigments and colors representing Paradise.
Well, as Dante is working mainly with light in Paradise, colors are very important to him because it's one of the main elements he can use to shape the different phases of the heavens and the planets were hosting the Dante and Beatrice along their ascending to the Empyrean. And even if Dante is not systematic in that, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you can't give one definite color to each of the planetary heavens, which is, in my opinion, probably why we don't find so much studies about that, because it's easy to study something when it's very systematic, but when it's not, one always stops saying, okay, but why there's not a color for this planet and so on. But for instance, when Dante describes the moon, he uses one shade of white, which is an opalescent white, which is different from, which is like albus in Latin, which is different from the candida rosa, which is candida by definition. So it's like optical white, I'd say, like not opalescent, but pure white. And between and it's interesting that Dante goes from white to white, like the white of the moon heaven is like the kind of opalescent white we can have on this heart, while the white of the Candida Rosa is the impossible pure white of the Empyrean. And in the middle of these two extremes, we find other different colors. So Mars is most about red, while Saturn is most silvery. And as I say, we don't find a single color for any of the planets, but we find some interesting references. And then what's interesting is that Dante even uses color as a sort of stage or light director of a theatrical production, because when there's that dialogue between St. Peter and the other blessed and Dante, and Peter gets very, very angry about what the Pope is doing on Earth, the colors of the scene change and becomes more reddish, more like to achieve a more terrible atmosphere in the middle of the quite peaceful atmosphere of heaven. So Dante even uses this kind of light effects, which today are quite usual to us because we see them in theaters, but it's not so common if we think. I mean, it would be interesting to inquire if there was this kind of light effects in theatrical, in medieval holy representations or something like that. But in my opinion, Dante is quite innovative in using this kind of effects. And that maybe I can stop here for now.
Yeah, there was certainly in theatrical productions, they used enormous numbers of bottles with candles in, to the extent which it became a fire hazard. What I was thinking of in relation to colour, there's very brilliant orchestration of different sorts of shades, lights and so on in Raphael's Transfiguration. The lower part of the picture where the disciples are failing to cure the mad boy, that's almost sort of proto-Caravaggio light, very heavy shadows, rather metallic highlights, which was specifically criticized by Sebastiano del Piombo when he was writing to Michelangelo. Anyway, there's a very sort of definite earthbound strong light system going on the lower part. And then this great blazing sight of Christ transfigured with a white come blue robe, but bleaching into pure white on either side of him. And the reactions are interesting because the two prophets can look at this vision. They can stand it, like Dante, they're in paradise, they can stand these bright lights, and they stare at Christ with no reservation. The three disciples who've gone up to the top of the mountain with Christ are literally blown backwards by the light. The light is not just an optical force, but it becomes a physical force which virtually knocks them over. I think that again is a very profoundly Dantesque motif, without being borrowed from Dante, but it's a matter of how you think about these things of divine light and natural light. And this is very sharply rendered in the contrast in the two halves of the Transfiguration, Raphael's last picture.
Yes. No, yeah, I was also thinking so about the structuring in a way of and the memorability as well of Paradiso. There is at certain points in Dante's Paradiso where the shades of the blessed take different shapes. They form like symbols such as the cross and the eagle. And I was thinking what you were saying before about the spatial aspect of shaping spaces only through the light. And so I was wondering if this like way of creating symbols is conceived in a way like a way of rendering more memorable specific spaces in Paradise, like apart from colors, as you said, that are not specifically assigned to planets, but also creating memorable images. If this can help in a way, the maybe it's not much a question, was more like a a comment to what you were saying about the creation of space in a way through lights. I'm not sure about how much this connects to a larger visual tradition, or if there were examples in this sense, previous textual examples.
Maybe I could comment on your comment by saying that for some of them, we actually have precedents. The most famous is the cross made by the souls with Christ showing on it, which is usually compared to that fantastic mosaic in Ravenna, in Santa Apollinare in Ravenna. But I would like to focus on the last of the icons created by Dante that I already mentioned, the Candida Rosa, which is quite a new one. I mean, probably we find some similar images. I'm thinking of some images in the manuscripts of Hildegard von Bingen. There's something flourishing like that, so it's not totally new. But Dante is very, very precise in choosing the rose and the shape of the rose as an emblem of the disposition on the blessed. And I'd like to stress it, because usually we don't usually grasp how Dante precises it in using the rose, because nowadays we are used to contemporary roses, which has modern roses, which are different from Dante's ones, and so once again, using manuscripts and medieval illumination is a good way to see how they actually received the kind of representations that Dante adopts. And here I'm referring to the British Library Egerton Dante, which is this incredible manuscripts full of images, which was realized just some 20 years about Dante's death. So it's also an early testimony of how they were visualizing the things Dante describes in his text. And here we see some of the passages that we have mentioned. So the punto che raggiava lume, so the point sending light, rays of light, which is ultimately God, the first image of God, the circles of the angels, then on the bottom, the umbriferi prefazzi with all this complex representation with the garden, the river of light, and so on. And then in that same scenery, we find the Candida Rosa. And here the illustrator is not so precise in grasping the fact that the blessed are themselves part of the Candida Rosa, while here the illustrator puts the Candida Rosa like in the middle of it, as if the blessed were just going around the rose, which is what Dante describes about the river of light, but then things are changing. But on the contrary, it gives us an element to understand what kind of rose Dante was writing of, which is not a modern rose. Modern rose have buds, rose buds, which are a form which is not very, very compatible with having a lot of blessed people sitting. But Dante's rose was a medieval rose. So what's nowadays is a Rosa alba officinalis, that specific type of rose, which is very different from our modern roses with buds, which is a plain rose, like almost a theater of petals. And if we compare this image with the image in the Egerton manuscripts, or with the extraordinary image in Giovanni di Paolo, we see how precise Dante is in using just the Candida Rosa as an emblem of what he wants to describe. And so it was a perfect invention, in my opinion, a very, very memorable one. And it's a pity that nowadays, with our modern Roses, we are carried away from the correct understanding of it.
Exactly. Picking up just one thing you said, I hope I got this right. You were mentioning the cross, which was made out of flying bits of dust or atomy in the air. And that's got an interesting history. And you see it in Albrecht Dürer. Giovanni di Paolo is rather good because he's still using the medieval resources to create this divine background. Anyway, Piero della Francesca, a very different system of reference. But if you look into the background down on the left there, you'll find that the little atomy which are described by Dante in the cross, the form of the cross, which becomes this this structure which is formed in the air from the thousands of little particles which are circulating in the air, the atomy, as Leonardo calls them. That it came classical antiquity. It's in Lucretius, this observation of the little dancing lights. And there is Piero della Francesca on the left. You can see the light coming in from the window, and where it crosses the shadow, there are thousands of little tiny spots of light pigment. Enormous patience, but just very delicately defining that light going through the space. And the Paradiso one is from side to side, from top to bottom, moves the lights, sparkling strongly as they met together and passed. Thus they are seen straight and twisted, swift and slow, changing appearance bodies of minute dimensions, moving through the rays of light, which sometimes streak across the shadow, which for our protection, human ingenuity and skill produce. The things for our projection are the shutters, which by implication are in the Dante. But that's a nice text, which, as I say, it's in classical antiquity, it's in Lucretius. It comes into Dante, it comes into Piero della Francesca, and it comes into Leonardo. And it's a testimony to how hard people writing these notions of light in the Renaissance or painting them, how hard they looked at the actual phenomena.
And given the time, would it be the right moment to take some questions from the audience, if there are any? You're welcome to write in the chat or just raise your hand.
There is
Yes,
a question.
George, go for it.
Sorry, I shall break the ice. I just want to ask you about a little bit about technical vocabulary, and specifically in the Commedia. I'm thinking of the passage in Paradiso 26 when Dante's the sight is returning to his eyes. There's a lot of words, very unusual and technically scientific words, including virtu stimativa, the estimative function. And I just wonder what this is actually really more of a question of poetics, but what you think about what that lends to poetry and why a poet might use scientific words to describe this kind of visual process, this process of optics, what that kind of intersection between visual art, science, and poetry, why that's important.
It's worth remembering that we have one word for light, which is light.
Yeah.
the Middle Ages, they had at least four. You have lux, lumen, splendor, and yeah, virtue is not a technical one of light, but it's a property of its special character. In that sense of light having a source, of having a passage through the air, and then the impinging of light on a surface. All these are differentiated with different in Latin and in Italian. They're differentiated by different words, whereas we call them light.
And if we look at this problem from the point of view of poetics, so why it is suitable for a poet to use this kind of technical vocabulary, my first answer would be that it has something to do with what lyrical poets were doing, when Dante was young, and Cavalcanti, first of all, as we all know, that was the first idea of, yes, we can use vernacular language to write about scientific concepts. And there's one passage in the Purgatory where Dante even uses possibile intelletto as a rhyme and syntagm, just exactly as Cavalcanti did. So it's clearly that, you know, beyond the biographical links, it's clear that Dante, when doing that kind of poetry, knows that someone before him was doing that kind of game, and it was Cavalcanti, with all the problems about the destiny of Cavalcanti and which kind of philosophy are you using to write that kind of poetry, and so forth. Yeah, on the one hand, there is this kind of literary models. And then on a broader way, I'd say that it's part of the attempt of Dante to use any possible human language in his poem. I mean, it wouldn't have been as complete as a representation of the world if he had left aside that kind of scientific language. And so why not? I mean, it's it's very, very far of the idea of poetry that, or a certain idea of poetry, but maybe nowadays we have to go going beyond that romantic idea. So it's not so scandalous that a poet uses this kind of words, after all.
Splendore is a very nice thing. There's no equivalent in modern discussion of light or the science of light. So, yeah, they've got a evocative vocabulary which can be inserted into poetic expression. And of course, most of these things are not talked about in Italian. It's worth remembering that these sorts of terms were those of medieval Latin, and they were not primarily Italian words. We find this with Leonardo all the time, when he's almost having to invent a kind of pseudo-Latin word for something because there's no word in Italian for it. So the science is predominantly a Latin science.
Could I just come in and ask a very brief question? And I want to thank you all, because this has been a really fascinating discussion about optics and about the ineffability of the world, the representability of things. But I want to bring you back to Purgatorio, if I can, just very briefly, because I'm very interested in Dante's kind of, George has alluded to, you've all alluded to it in certain ways, that the language of the pictorial arts, and I'm thinking about Dante's kind of pictorialist poetics, when, you know, in and around the Purgatorio 10, when we talk about the visibile parlare, visible speech, and how language is somehow coming short to talk about how God's art is represented in the marble reliefs on the terrace of the Proud. And Dante, in that particular canto and in the canto surrounding that terrace up to 12, uses a lot of kind of pictorialist language. He talks about pennelleggiare. He uses stilo. And I wonder if you, and of course you famously then have the discussion about Cimabue and Giotto as artists. And I'm just wondering if you say a little bit, you know, given what we're talking about here, because yes, Paradise is the big challenge, but Dante's actual, if you like, rapport with artists, with the kind of the nuts and bolts of art.
Yeah, I think Federico can have a go at that first while I collect my thoughts.
Well, first of all, the relationship that Dante had with art was in some ways a direct one, because there's that famous passage in the Vita Nova where Dante himself when Dante presents himself as drawing angels of some tablets in the moment when he thinks of Beatrice. So there weren't even some a bold hypothesis by Sant'Agata about the fact that maybe Dante was part of that specific guild in Florence as a painter. And then this hypothesis has been put into doubt by historians because it's not so easy, but it seems to have had some direct grasp on which kind of very, very specific instruments painters used, and even presents himself as a practitioner of painting in that passage of the Vita Nova. So that's the first things that comes to my mind. And then about the Visibile Parlare, is very, very specific in using the lexicon, the vocabulary of painting, but it's also very, very aware of, I could say, the matters of iconography and iconology, because when he presents the announce to Mary as an example of humility, is done exactly was what painters and sculptors did at this time. So it does not only he knows how to use the instruments of painting from a technical point of view, but also from, I could say, a symbolic point of view. He knows how a picture would use a picture, and an advisor would set up a cycle of frescoes, for instance, of sculptures or reliefs in his Visibile Parlare. So it really seems one that knows. And
well, I agree, Federico, you did right. I mean, I think the Annunciation is the perfect, that's part of the iconography of Western Christianity. Although you would have to say that the other two, David dancing before the ark and Trajan talking to the widow, the Vedovella, they're his decisions, they're slightly different, I would say.
Well, there was there's an interesting book by Vincenzo Tedesco which came out like a couple of months ago about the myth of Trajan, and this motif, which goes around in texts about the legend of Gregory the Great, but there were also the influence of the relief of Trajan's column in Rome, and so there was some kind of visual tradition, even if probably it's not so it's not everywhere like the Annunciation. While yes, David, it's more tricky. I'd like to know better if there actually weren't representations of it, which wouldn't surprise me. Or maybe Dante is doing what he does everywhere. He does as other people do, and then he adds something special of his, which makes it beyond what you actually could find.
And because David, as the umile salmista, has a very specific kind of significance for Dante, poeta.
Sure.
Thank you.
Just about, again, about Annunciation, I suppose. So Martin Eisner has written an article on Francesca, actually, in Inferno 5, and how the Annunciation model, obviously there's no kind of really pictorial reference there per se, but what he's arguing there is that he's so familiar with those iconographic models that he's almost importing this Annunciation model to describe Francesca and her sort of reading, and how that is also influenced by certain kind of versions of Annunciation that's becoming more popular in 14th and 13th centuries of sort of Mary reading as she receives a message, she's going to conceive this baby and so on. So maybe there's also visual art and iconography also in scenes that do not directly reference visual arts as well.
Yeah, as a footnote, I'm still nagging away at this problem of Raphael and paradoxes within his painting, which confound the the optical and measurable sight of it. The vision of Ezekiel, which is slide number 30, vision of Ezekiel with the symbols of the evangelists, and it looks as if he's floating fairly close to us with the landscape behind, but it doesn't work out like that. The tree, if you look at it in the bottom, is in front of the clouds. So the image itself must be way back in space and be extremely large. And then on the bottom left, you can see the light rays coming through and striking these two figures who are witness of the scene. But again, a paradox which I think is very deeply Dantesque. As I said, Raphael was a kind of hero of the book, which I didn't expect, but he looks like an artist of measured truths, and in fact he's an artist of spiritual paradoxes. It seemed to have killed the conversation. Sorry about that.
No, I think that was a very beautiful image of the spiritual paradoxes is what Dante basically is doing for all the Paradiso, as Federico was saying. It seems that it's the most unrealistic thing, but what he's doing is trying to represent the reality of God, and you can do just probably through a spiritual paradox, I guess. And I'm not sure if there are any other questions from the audience, or maybe we can thank all our speakers, because I'm aware that the time is flowing.
I was thinking that Dante would love the paradox in Raffaello's painting, but would never put himself as small in one margin as the one in the vision. Dante is always at the center, even if perceiving the vision.
That's a good point.
Well, then, thank you so much to both of you. That was a very fascinating dialogue. I think we will think about all these many points we raised today. It was truly a pleasure to have you both in dialogue. And I want to thank you, Martin and Federico, and also all the public that joined us online. Thank you so much for being with us for this hour and a half. And thank you so much to Dara as well for helping coordinating the organization of the Dante Dialogues, and of course Aistė. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you soon in the next Dante Dialogue. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for organizing it. As always, if you devote thought to these things directed by somebody outside one's own professional domain, it suggests all sorts of possibilities you've not thought of before, and I'm now in that position, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before we go today, I just want to say a few words, because today's dialogue was basically the final outward-looking event of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland for this particular academic year. And I'd like to thank, as Elsina has done, our guests today, Martin and Federico. It really was exceptional. It was wonderful to hear the two of you talk with such knowledge, such depth, and with great ingenuity about some very, very complex things. And it was a wonderful way to end things off. I would especially like to thank all of the members of the Centre for their work throughout the year, and by that I mean Elsina Rosati, Dario Galassini, Chiara Valcelli, Federico Colluzzi, Valentina Mele, and George Rayson. And a very special thank you to Aistė Kiltinavičiūtė and to Elsina Caponetti, who organised today's dialogue. We'll be back again in September when we'll have the wonderful Jamaican poet Lorna Goodison coming over to Cork, and we'll be launching her really, truly exceptional and unique Dante's Inferno, which was published very recently by Carcanet Press. And I can also reveal that next year's Dante Lecture Series is going to have a stellar cast with some really wonderful guests, so that's something to look forward to. many of our members will be speaking at various conferences and fora and symposia over the next couple of months, but this really concludes our activities for this academic year. So thank you to all of the members of the Centre. Thank you for today's speakers, and thank you to our audience who are very loyal, and we greatly, greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to the next dates.
Thank you so much.